Hello, Alaskans. I've spent the past week very much focused on the qualifications of Judge Brett Kavanaugh as to be the next Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was nominated by President Trump earlier in the week. And as I've mentioned, I have known Judge Kavanaugh ever since we worked in the Bush administration together and have been rereading a number of his opinions. Importantly, we had a very good meeting today, over an hour long, where we covered a number of topics that I think are really important to our state, that I believe that our fellow Alaskans care deeply about. Let me just review a couple of those and what we talked about. First, Judge Kavanaugh is somebody who believes strongly that the role of a judge is to review and interpret the written text of both the Constitution and federal statutes. He emphasized that again and again. He also emphasized that he is not a judge that will be results-oriented. Too often, particularly with the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals judges, we see judges who want to come out and have a certain policy result and then try to find a way to reason towards that result. That's not the role of a judge. That's the role of a legislator. The role of a judge is to interpret the law and Constitution as written. Judge Kavanaugh believes in that. His opinions certainly attest to the fact that he's very focused on that as a role. I think that's critical for Alaska, critical for next Supreme Court justice. Second, we talked a lot about the Second Amendment. He has been very active. As some of you know, the landmark decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, Heller versus the District of Columbia, that for the first time in U.S. history determined that the Second Amendment is an individual right that applies to all Americans, a fundamental right. In a very important case, when that case from the Supreme Court was remanded to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Judge Kavanaugh wrote a very powerful dissent on what the D.C. Circuit did. I recommend Alaskans read that to get a sense of his breadth, not just on the Second Amendment, but on issues of judicial interpretation and construction and the way statutes and the Constitution are supposed to be read. I reread that recently. We talked at length about that. He is a strong defender of the Second Amendment. And third, we talked at length about his views that federal agencies should not be able to take on powers that they don't have in terms of statutory authority from the Congress. He's been a leader in this area for federal courts of appeals. I think this is a critical issue for our state. When I was Attorney General, when I was DNR Commissioner, certainly as your Senator, we've seen time and time again, a state like ours, 66% of our land is federal government controlled, and when federal agencies push the limits of the law, this is a judge and I think a justice who will say no to the power of federal agencies when they're acting beyond the statutory scope of their power and responsibilities. Again, we talked at length about this issue, and I think that he will be a leader. He has been a leader on the federal courts of appeals on it. This is a critically important issue for our state. Finally, I spent a lot of time with him going through specific Alaska federal statutes and explaining to him their importance. That's ANCSA, that's the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System Act, the TAPS Act, that's ANILCA. I actually had a copy of the entire ANILCA legislation. If you take a look at it, it's quite long, and the conference report, which is hundreds of pages. And I even said the new ANWR legislation. These are all Alaska-specific cases, often decided by judges who don't know much about Alaska, and I emphasize just how important it would be if he were to be a Supreme Court justice to keep an eye on these cases. Oftentimes, federal agencies ignore the statutory mandates of ANILCA, for example, and the interpretation is oftentimes interpreted wrongly from my perspective by federal court judges on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So we had an extensive conversation about that. Overall, like I've said before, I believe he's a man of integrity. As I said, I've known him for many years. He has, I think, what would be very good judicial temperament, a quality that comes out when you meet with him, and it certainly came out today. He's a very humble man. Deep humility, which I think is also a good characteristic for a judge. After the meeting, which was over an hour in my office, I did say I plan to support his nomination. I think he'll be good for the country. In particular, I think he'll be good for our great state. So that's an update on a very important meeting we had today. Thank you.